From the beginning, this show has also been able to be put on with our generous host, Anh Viet Thanh Nguyen, who is one of the co-founders of the Diasporic Vietnamese Artist Network and the author of the Pulitzer Prize-winning novel, The Sympathizer, which is currently being adapted by HBO into a television series for 2023. Its sequel, The Committed, the best-selling short story collection, The Refugees, and the children's book, Chicken of the Sea, co-written with his son, Allison. So if y'all could drop in the chat and give him a warm welcome, please welcome my co-host, Anh Viet Thanh Nguyen.
Hey, Philip, so good to be here with you and with everybody out there right now. It's such a great pleasure to be speaking with Phong Nguyen tonight as our special guest. He is the author of the novel, The Bronze Drum, and we'll be talking a lot more about that with him tonight. But he's also the author of 5 other books, and Bronze Drum, the most recent one, was named one of NPR's best books of the year for 2022. His books have won awards, including the Prairie Heritage Award and the Elixir Press Fiction Award. He currently serves as the Miller Family Endowed Chair in Literature and Writing at the University of Missouri, where he teaches fiction writing. Phong, glad to have you with us.
Great to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
No problem. And, you know, we met in person a few times, but the last time was in Columbia, Missouri at the Unbound Book Festival. I just want to give a shout out to the Unbound Book Festival in Columbia, Missouri, and the Skylark Bookshop out there that puts it on, and Alex George, the owner of the store. Yeah,
we're gearing up for it right now. So yeah, it's been in my mind day in, day out.
Yeah, it's an amazing book festival in case you have the chance to go out to Columbia, Missouri to celebrate that. But we're here to talk about your novel, The Bronze Drum, Phong. Congratulations on that. It's a real epic and a real page turner. Such a pleasure to read. Now,
Thank you so much.
The Bronze Drum is about the legendary Jung sisters, 2 women who I think most Vietnamese people have heard of, but it's perhaps true that a lot of people who are not Vietnamese may never have heard of the Jung sisters, and yet they're at the center of this epic novel, The Bronze Drum. Can you tell us who the Jung sisters are and why did they inspire you to write this novel?
Sure. The Trung sisters lived about 2,000 years ago. The events in the novel take place between the years of 36 CE to 43 CE. And what was going on during this period, which corresponds with the Bronze Age and what were then called the Lac Viet territories, was that the Han Chinese had occupied Lac Viet for maybe 3, maybe 4 generations. And there was a new governor that was brought in who was introduced a bunch of draconian new laws, raising taxes, forcing young Viet men to have to go fight in distant wars for China. He forced aristocrats to marry and imposed a Confucian family structure on what was a more tribal, and the consensus of historians at the time is that it was more matriarchal, matrilineal kind of society. And there was one lord that spoke up against these draconian new laws named Lord Chung, and he was repaid for his boldness by having his palace sieged and having his head taken as a trophy for the emperor. And the governor thought it would end there, but he didn't account for his 2 daughters, Chung Chok and Chung Yi, who the fire revolution was lit in their bellies, and they raised an army of 80,000 women, fought off the Han occupation on Viet lands, and reigned as kings for 3 years until China sent its fiercest general Ma Yuan with a massive army to quell the rebellion. And he, after driving the Trung sisters to the edge of a cliff, where according to the mythic version, Vietnamese version, they jumped off the cliff into the Red River, and according to the contemporaneous historical version that Ma Yuan wrote, they were caught and beheaded. I went with the Vietnamese version in the book for many reasons, but the foremost of which is that it's the more poetic and fitting ending for the story I wanted to tell. And then he wanted all the bronze drums, which was a symbol of Viet pride and Viet military strength, to be rounded up and melted into base metal, and constructed these pillars of bronze at the southernmost point of the Lac Viet territories, and said that as long as these pillars stand, the Han will rule in this land. We know that we don't know what happened to those pillars, but we know that today archaeologists still find these bronze drums that have been buried by these women who refused to give them up and hid them or buried them, and as a testament to their influence, the way that they have inspired Vietnamese people for 2,000 years.
Yeah, so as I said, I think most Vietnamese people at least have heard of the names of the Jung sisters, and I'm curious, when did you first encounter those kinds of stories? Was it from your parents or your families, and then
Yeah.
what made you think that this would be a great material for a novel?
So I heard it growing up, but it wasn't like my dad sat me down and said, "Son, now I'm going to impart to you Vietnamese culture." You know, it was just one of my father's favorite stories to tell. So he might tell like a Cinderella story and the Snow White or something, and then the Chung sisters. So I kind of thought it was canon. Like I thought everybody knew about it. And when I learned that none of my friends or teachers or anyone around me knew about it, eventually I realized, you know, when I got older, that if I ever wanted to read a book about the Chung sisters, I would have to write it. So, as far as the need to bring this narrative to readers, I felt like it was an inherently compelling story on its own. And I also wanted readers like me to have somewhere to go to for stories about ancient history in Vietnam.
Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but it's an oral story, right? It's fables, it's passed on through families, or are there actual texts and books about the Jung sisters?
Well, it's interesting because one of the things that somehow found its way into the promotional material for Bronze Drum is this idea that it's purely oral tradition. But in Vietnam, there's plays, there's comic books, there's all kinds of written material about the Chung sisters. So it's true that during the time period in which they lived, Vietnam was not a written culture, and it wasn't even called Vietnam, right? Um, but there have been many interpretations of the Chung sister story in contemporary Vietnam. So I think it's sort of made for good promotion to say it's something from oral tradition being put in writing for the first time, but it's just the first time that I know of that's been made into a novel in English. I think that's the difference.
I think it's definitely true. I haven't heard of a Jung sisters novel in English before, which raises the issue, what kind of liberties did you take with telling the story? And we all, we're writers, we we lie,
Yeah,
we
yeah,
navigate, we twist things to our own needs and purposes, and I think that's
sure,
all fine.
sure.
But it'd be interesting to know, like, if you did take departures from sort of like the big features that a lot of Vietnamese people would know about this story.
Yeah, so I was confronted with a choice very early on of how much to incorporate of the historical version, the contemporaneous Chinese historical version, which was recorded by Ma Yuan, the victorious general who ultimately led to the deaths of the Chung sisters, and the extent to which I was going to utilize the mythic Vietnamese version of the story. So I was already confronted with choosing between two different canonical versions of the story. And so for that reason, adding a third component, which is my own invention, was both necessary and not a big leap, right? So for example, when it came to the character of the Chung sisters themselves, in the Vietnamese version, they're like saints, right? They're even like gods in some parts of the country. And in the Chinese version, they're like demons. And so obviously I couldn't go with either of those. That's not going to fit in a contemporary novel, these, flawless figures that can do no wrong, or these demonic heroes, right? So I needed to, the first liberty I had to take is to make them human, right? To make them flawed, to make them real. And so yeah, it was the invention came very early on from that. I call it an evenly split, like 1/3 history, 1/3 myth, and 1/3 invention. So like the single name characters like Ha, the guardsman, Ming, Zui, and Mai, they're all my own creations, but basically all the rest of the characters are historical.
Did you feel pressure when you were taking on this task and Phong to keep it either like fully history or to really like fictionalize it all the way. And what was the community reception when you first published the book?
Yeah. So, I wasn't really intimidated or pressured only because I didn't cast myself in the role of writing a definitive version of the Chung sisters. I felt like I was starting a conversation that others would continue in the future. And but this does speak to the question of audience. And I was thinking of my audience as people like myself, like who are part of the Vietnamese diaspora, but didn't have a chance to read stories, especially stories about the Trung sisters, but stories about ancient Vietnam and things that are before the Vietnam War. And so the reception from that audience has been very positive. The reception, I think, from audiences in general has been very warm, but I'm especially heartened by the response of Vietnamese American readers who know the Trung sisters but have never had the opportunity until now to read about them in a novel.
Yeah, definitely. And as I'm starting to read Bronze Drum, my grandma, she had this lacquer painting of the Jung sisters on the
Oh yeah,
elephants hanging at her house. So
yeah, yeah.
it feels great to be able to feel that breath of life come into this painting that was so ubiquitous to my upbringing, right?
Yeah, that was one of the things that, so I say in the acknowledgments at the end that there's a lot of intentional anachronisms, and the elephants are one of them because according to the anthropological archaeologists that I worked with, they would not have had elephants used for war purposes at that time, but it was so important to the image of the Chung sisters that I had to include the elephant. So there's a bunch of things like that. So.
Oh, I just want to hear about more. Like, what other things did you do? Are there like
Well,
lightsabers in there, or
almost.
Are the Jung sisters wearing an Apple Watch? Apple watches,
No. But there's the other really obvious anachronisms are the Ao Zai and the Non La, right? So like they're often represented in pop culture wearing the Non La and wearing Ao Zai, and so I wanted to honor that, even though those are anachronisms. Yeah.
Well, I mean, it's like watching, movies about Robin Hood, for
Yeah.
example, or watching movies like King Arthur is probably the better example, like
Right.
King Arthur and his knights wearing plate armor. This is where the nerd in me comes out. They're wearing plate armor. They didn't have plate armor back in 800 AD or whatever it was when Arthur was the king, right? So at the level of myth and fable, but especially of storytelling, these kinds of things I think are totally
Yeah. I mean, there was a lot of like this is more so in the earlier drafts, but there was a lot of what I might call like fan service for people who knew already the story of the Chung sisters. So like the 36 generals, all women, all are known for various feats that they performed on the field of battle, and I included many of those in the story, but the editors were like, why is this in here? Like this, you introduce this character and they do this amazing thing and then they disappear, or they get a little backstory or whatever. And I ultimately agreed with them, except for Phong Tịch Chinh, who gives birth on the battlefield and continues to go on fighting after slinging the baby into the quiver. And that it was so. And I got the same note on that. What is the narrative purpose of this scene in the story? And my response was sheer badassery.
And I know. I was gonna say I know, Anfang, you also teach story like fiction writing.
Yes,
right?
That's right.
So I wanted to talk a little bit about ask you about what the research process was like going into this book, right?
Yeah. So when I began researching it, must have been like 2014 or 2015. It seemed like an impossible task, right? I went to the library, I found wall-to-wall, floor-to-ceiling shelves about the Vietnam War, and very little before the French occupation. Thousands of books were written in English about Vietnam in the 20th century and nothing at all about the Chung sisters. I started to find individual chapters and books with titles like Women Warriors and Tigers and the Rice. And eventually I discovered the works of Keith Taylor, who wrote The Birth of Vietnam and Histories of Vietnam. And while I was in the process of researching, a book came out by Nam Si Kim called The Origins of Ancient Vietnam. And so I contacted both Keith Taylor and Nam Si Kim, but Nam and I struck up a correspondence. And Nam, who is an archaeological anthropologist at UW-Madison, he would answer all my questions, big and small, in a very quick timeline. So it was a very important resource to the writing of this book. And I had to make a lot of choices along the way about where to deviate from the historical accounts, as I mentioned, and where to preserve them. And but as far as like the material stuff, that was much easier for him to answer than the immaterial stuff. So I wanted to know, for example, what is the medicinal system? What was the calendrial system, and this kind of thing? And he wasn't able to. He would say, well, maybe in southern China at the time, this was what was going on, and maybe the aristocrats would have had access. But when it came to like ceramic tiles on the roofs and clay construction and all this kind of stuff, he knew all of it and was very dependable.
You are now listening to Accented Dialogues in Diaspora, presented by the Diasporic Vietnamese Artists Network. My name is Philip Nguyen. I'm one of the co-hosts here with my co-host Viet Thanh Nguyen, and we are interviewing Phong Nguyen, a lot of Nguyens in the house tonight, about his novel, The Bronze Drum. So, and Phong, thank you for giving some more context into what it was like to start and work through writing such an epic novel about an epic fable.
Yeah.
Kind of segueing into the beginning of your book. Your book begins with 4 inscriptions with a shared / similar sentiment from Toni Morrison, Alan Moore, Peter S. Beagle, and Viet Thanh Nguyen. What was that? What was your thought process behind that? Like, why did you want to evoke these four individuals at the beginning?
So one reason behind the epigraph is to show how the same phrase can mean dramatically different things depending on the context. So when Viet Thanh Nguyen writes about that nothing ever dies, I think it's accurate to say he's referring to the trauma of war and how it persists and endures into the present despite being relegated by some to history. When Toni Morrison writes nothing ever dies, it's in the context of a ghost story, and so that implies both the literal and the figurative. And you might say in a deeper way, both statements are about epigenetics, but the context really matters. And when the character of Lear from Peter S. Beagle's The Last Unicorn says nothing ever ends, he's suggesting that literature and legends tell us a lie in the way that they arbitrarily choose where to end a story. And Alan Moore has Dr. Manhattan say the same thing, but he puts it in the voice of this godlike figure, which gives the statement a kind of cosmic significance. So I found this really important and relevant to the story of the Chung sisters, because people will reasonably wonder why the story of the 2 sisters from 2,000 years ago is significant to a contemporary context. And I feel like putting the Chung sister story into a contemporary context gives us new understandings, both of them and of ourselves.
Well, thankfully, I have read all 4 of those authors, including Viet Thanh Nguyen, amazingly enough. This is Viet Thanh Nguyen, by the way, speaking about himself, yes. But I had not read Peter Beagle since I was in high school, but The Last Unicorn was a great read, and of course I've read Toni Morrison, but Alan Moore I've also read too. But what I think about specifically here is that the character of Dr. Manhattan in Alan Moore's Watchmen, that's what we're talking about.
That's right.
Yeah, in the film adaptation, in the film adaptation, not the HBO TV series, but the film adaptation, he goes to Vietnam during the war, American War, and basically uses his super atomic powers to wipe out the Vietnamese communists and the Viet Cong, right? And then in the HBO TV series, the Americans have won the war and turned Vietnam into the 51st state, I believe. Right. And Dr. Manhattan there is part of this colonizing American presence. It's just sort of, I don't know if you were thinking about that sort of connection.
Yeah. Well, it's, I absolutely hate the movie of The Watchmen. And the reason is that it seems to, the comic book does such a good job of satirizing and exposing the bloodthirstiness of superhero worship, right? And and by simply turning into film, but also turning into film with that particular director and that particular script, it seemed to glorify the violence that was portrayed, as opposed to demonstrating the excesses of these so-called heroes, right? Um, but yeah, no, I hadn't been thinking about the show adaptation, but that's as an interesting wrinkle into the reference to Moore's book.
Well, because the Jung sisters are obviously very important to Vietnamese tradition because of their resistance against invasion and outsiders. It's very
Yeah,
patriotic, nationalistic narrative and all of that. And then, of course, you have the Americans coming in. But one thing that occurs to me is that in the context of like American and British superhero traditions, we've gotten to a point where we can have anti-heroes as superheroes.
yeah,
That our superheroes can now do terrible things, and Watchmen really helped to inaugurate that. But in Vietnamese tradition, I don't know if we've reached that point yet. Like now that you've written The
mhm,
Bronze Drum, maybe now we can have the Dark Jung sisters.
right.
Other version of Vietnamese
Gritty
history,
reboot.
the Jung sisters were actually really like they did terrible things like eat babies or something. I don't know,
Right, right, yeah,
but I don't know if we're at that point in Vietnamese and Vietnamese American traditions or histories or literatures where we would feel comfortable going into our own lore and really turning it inside out. But I
yeah,
mean, The Bronze Drum, I mean, your novel, I think, is one of the first steps that makes it possible, maybe for the next writer or the next generation to do something
yeah,
really kind of weird with Vietnamese tradition.
yeah, 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 I look forward to talking with Quế Mai about Tale of Q as well as like a you know I mean, obviously it's not an anti-hero type of story, but there's a lot of villainy in it, and there's some redemption in it as well. So but no, yeah, no anti-hero, no Godfather, Michael Corleone
Well,
character.
honestly, I think I have to write The Bronze Drum Part 2, where the Jung sisters do
That would
something
be
terrible.
awesome.
Okay, let's hear from The Bronze Drum itself, however.
Sure.
Can you do a reading for us from the novel?
Yeah, I'll just read the first page of the prologue. Um, Gather around, children of Chuzien, and be brave. For even to listen to the story of the Trung sisters is, in these troubled times, a dangerous act. The Han gods are jealous of Viet heroes, and while the Han have ruled Lac Viet for 100 years, our legends threaten to reduce the empire to ashes. Behold the lacquered puppets dancing on a clear pool of water under the moonlight, and think back farther than you ever have before to your ancestor memory and witness. Here are the Trung sisters. Trung Nhi is wild and venturesome, while Trung Trok is disciplined and proud. They ride into war on the backs of elephants, wearing golden armor, brandishing swords that flash in the sun, leading an army of women. And in the distance, the thrashing of the bronze drum announcing the battle at hand. Look, the wicked Han governor enters the stage. He takes Viet honor and blood as if they were shimmering coins in his hands. He will settle for nothing but total subjugation. Soon the armies will clash on the field. The Viet women love freedom and will not bow. The Han men fight to conquer what was never theirs to rule, the soul of this country, its unobtainable heart. And I'll end there.
We are
Oof.
with the novelist Phong Nguyen, who has just read an excerpt to us from his novel, The Bronze Drum, historical epic about the Jung sisters, two legendary women from a very early period in Vietnam's history who mobilized the people of Vietnam to fight against Chinese invasion and oppression. So Phong, it's a really brilliant novel, really epic, page-turning read, but it's also a novel about two women, and you're not a
Yes.
woman. So, and I wonder how did you feel? Did that occur to you? This issue of you as a man coming in to take on this epic story about two women in the
Yeah.
Vietnam tradition.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a great book by Paisley Rectal called Appropriate, which is sort of written in the form of a letter to a student that was asking whether the student sort of timidly asked, is it okay to like appropriate the stories of others? And she's talking a very deep and complex answer to this question. And I didn't have the benefit of that book when I was writing this, but it really resonated with me when I did, in terms of the kind of work that you want to do and the kind of investigation into one's motives for doing so, and so on. So, I aspire to the right to be called a feminist, which I think is ultimately demonstrated by one's actions rather than one's speech. But I also think that for readers who don't claim themselves to be feminists, it should be easy to understand that women can be stronger than men. And I mean that literally. I mean, powerful women are all around us. You can't go through life without noticing this, as far as I'm concerned. And I feel like one has to be willfully blinded by ideology to believe otherwise. So I feel like in Bronze Drum, I'm just describing what I see in the world, but on a grand scale, on an epic kind of scope. So through that lens, I found that, I was able to write from individuals, right? Because we are all kind of a host of various identities, but ultimately consciousness itself is not gendered, right? And so if I thought of them as Chung Chak and everything that implied and everything that was in her character, I thought of her as Chung Nhi and everything that implied and everything in her character, realizing that the differences in experience are great, but part of the differences in experiences that are great have to do not only with gender, not only with region and era, but with privilege as well, in terms of being aristocrats, right? That was hard enough to wrap my head around, and trying to represent what it must be like to live that kind of life where you are born into leadership. So all of those things were in the stew.
So help me think through something here, which is that Vietnamese culture, at least in the contemporary era, tends to be kind of patriarchal, male dominated, and so that's not always really been true throughout Vietnamese history. It's kind of a complex issue, but and you've done a lot of research into this in the purposes of writing the novel. How do you think that a culture such as the Vietnamese one, which seems to tend to favor patriarchy and men, at least in the public and so on, and in private in a lot of ways too, how does that culture end up with two women as part of the national pantheon of heroes?
Yeah. Well, I like to answer that question by way of drawing a distinction between them and like Joan of Arc, for example, because Joan of Arc coronated a king, but the Trung sisters became kings, right? And Joan of Arc emerged out of a culture in which she at first had to pretend to be a man. And in the case of the Trung sisters, the leadership of women was not an unprecedented idea. So it was, it's not a consensus among all historians of the period, but it is a very prominent thread in the history of this period, that what was there before the Confucian tradition was matriarchal, and it was one of the reasons why the Trung sisters were able to emerge out of that model. And this is a time period in which, as I mentioned, 3 or 4 generations of Han rule, and it was very much still contested. And so it could be possible for one's neighbors to hold to a Confucian tradition and to have a traditional Confucian marriage, and for their neighbors to have a very different arrangement. And it's something that I think it's easy to put modern Vietnamese culture in contrast with the West and make sort of sweeping judgments about the role of women, but I think that would be kind of faulty in a number of ways. For one thing, when during the Vietnam War, American soldiers saw that there were women, Vietnamese women in combat, that was to them like an offensive idea. But I think we've come around to a point where women in the military in the US is now more accepted and more embraced. And so in a number of ways, Vietnamese approach to the role of women is more progressive than in the West.
Definitely. Thanks, Phong, for that. I kind of want to take a step back, and when you were reading through the prologue, one of the things I noticed, and it's also referenced throughout the book, is that these are Viet heroes, and there's Viet honor and blood on the line, right? It's not Vietnamese, it's just Viet. And I think, growing up in this ASEAN pride moment, or like the Viet pride moment, I feel very seen and resonant in that sort of way. For you, like, how much of your own identity and upbringing was imbued in this particular work?
Yeah. So it's one of those things, right? It's so fundamental that it's difficult to analyze, right? And it's sort of like David Foster Wallace used to tell a joke about an old fish who swims past a couple of young fish and greets them by saying, "Morning, boys, how's the water?" And after he passes, they go on a ways until one of the young fish turns to the other and says, "What the hell is water?" Right? So, I mean, I've heard other Vietnamese American writers generalize about their cultural experience, how it impacts their art, and sometimes it resonates and sometimes it doesn't. And I think the experiences are very individual, and though some things feel more particular to our community because they're rare outside of it. For example, I remember talking to one well-known Vietnamese American writer who said that Vietnamese people love Elvis and hate the Beatles, but my dad is a huge Beatles fan and he's pretty indifferent to Elvis, and so am I. And so sometimes the generalizations apply, sometimes they don't, but sometimes they, we extrapolate and make something that's more universal out of something that's just very particular. So I don't know if that answers your question, but yeah.
Yeah, definitely. And I was also just going to follow up, because I know you're based out of Missouri too, right?
Yes.
So, I mean, was
Yeah.
it helpful to be in this, because I don't think there's like a significant Viet population in Missouri.
No, Kansas City is and somewhat in St. Louis, but so yeah, where I grew up in central New Jersey, and there was only one other Vietnamese American family in our town, and they had recently immigrated, and they spoke no English. And my father, by contrast, came over in 1962 on scholarship, and sometime in the late 60s met and married my mother, who's white. And so we have a very different context from the one other Vietnamese American family. So when it comes to, like, I didn't have the advantage of growing up in Orange County or even like Gulf Coast, where you have large Vietnamese American communities already there. So in writing this book, it was imagining a reader like myself who was hungry for these kinds of things and for these kinds of stories and community in writing.
I've read your other work, and of course you've written as an American. You have a novel, for example, about Huckleberry Finn. Oh no,
Yes.
I'm sorry, about Tom
Joe Harper.
Joe Harper, I'm sorry. Yeah, but about the whole, Mark Twain universe of characters, for example.
Yeah.
So, just for readers who have not encountered your work before, it's not as if you are one of these Vietnamese American writers like me, Viet Thanh Nguyen, who's only written about Vietnamese people for the most part, but you clearly stake your territory before this novel on the whole territory of being an American writer, as you are.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because in Joe Harper, it is taking the world of Twain, but also introducing a character, Lee, who is ethnically Chinese but from Vietnam, and so he is and the reason I introduced that character had a lot to do with Twain himself and his own sympathies and his own writings about Chinese Americans, right? And so he was, when he was working at the San Francisco Morning Call, what he witnessed there as a beat reporter, as the only beat reporter for the San Francisco Morning Call, was a lot of violence dealt by Irish laborers against the Chinese immigrants. And he was horrified by it, and he saw that the police either ignored it or participated in the violence. and he wrote about it. His publisher, I mean, the San Francisco Morning Call, I think it was George Barnes was the editor, wouldn't publish it. And so he had to publish in the Galaxy, and he had to publish in other venues. And so he had these very strong feelings about the early immigrants from Asia. And you know, I'm often asked the question when I talk about Adventures of Joe Harper, what gave me the sort of license to write in the world of Twain. And I think for me, it was an understanding of something that he cared deeply about, but never really got to write about in his fiction, and bringing that to life. So I see those not as completely separate and distinct, but as consistent.
So for this book, Bronze Drum, you know, even though the tale is set in 40 CE, you mentioned earlier that so many of the themes ring true to the contemporary moment. For all of our readers out there who are, you know, are looking to pick up the book or are reading it, what can they expect to learn from this powerful, historic, fabled sister duel?
Well, I think that the Kirkus reviewer wrote it best when he said it reminds us that the power of women is nothing new. So we, for some reason, think of the empowerment of women as this modern invention and as a Western invention, but I don't think history really bears that out in a neat way as the narrative implies. And you know, it's relevant because, you know, their downfall is that they become enamored of their own accomplishments and their glory, which leads to complacency and kind of a failure to shore up their allies. Although in the Trung sisters' case, it was also a failure of the men around them to accept their leadership because of the lure of Confucianism was too strong. I think it's a matter of, you know, learning which mistakes to learn from, which mistakes not to repeat from history, and not to abandon the leadership of powerful women when given that role. And now we've not had a woman head of state in the United States, and I think one of the motivations for, or not motivations for writing, but the sense of urgency behind writing it is when in 2016, you know, the country, not the majority, but a substantial part of the population decided to elect a highly incompetent and inexperienced man instead of a, you know, whatever you think of her politics, a very experienced and very capable woman. I think being able to embrace the leadership of powerful women is one of the most important lessons of the book.
That is a great message to leave our audience with. It's been such a pleasure
Bravo.
To Phong Nguyen, the author of the novel The Bronze Drum, which is out everywhere now. And it's a novel about the Trung sisters, two women who have been legendary in Vietnamese history for their efforts to mobilize the Vietnamese people against outside aggression and invasion. But as Phong says, have also left us a lesson about feminism, that it exists everywhere in the world, but especially in this case in Vietnam. Phong, it's been such a pleasure to talk to you.
The pleasure's all mine. Thank you so much.
Thank you for joining us.